The hidden ward. The morning light barely seeped through the thick, dusty windows of St. Martha's Memorial Hospital. Dr. Elias Hartman adjusted his coat as he walked through the eerily quiet corridors. Unlike the bustling modern wings filled with life-saving machines and the hurried steps of staff, this older section of the hospital had been long abandoned. Officially, it was off-limits. But Dr. Hartman, a man driven by curiosity and a lingering sense of duty, often found himself drawn to this desolate wing during his late shifts. A tall man in his early 40s with a reputation for brilliance in the field of medicine, Dr. Hartman was known for his calm demeanor and sharp intellect. However, beneath the surface of his composed exterior lay the shadows of personal loss. His wife, Claire, had passed away 5 years earlier after a sudden illness, leaving him alone in their empty suburban home. The echoes of her laughter and the dreams they shared haunted him. Their hope for a child had died with her. Perhaps it was this void in his life that made him notice the little details others overlooked. Small things, a misplaced chair, faint scuff marks on the floor, or the occasional sound in a supposedly empty building, caught his attention. He had often chalked it up to the settling of an old structure or his imagination playing tricks on him during long shifts. But tonight was different. The evening was unusually still as Dr. Hartman ventured into the abandoned wing. This part of the hospital, once a pediatric ward, had been closed for years due to budget cuts and safety concerns. Its walls were lined with faded murals of cheerful animals and sunny skies, a stark contrast to the darkness that now enveloped them. He carried a flashlight, its beam slicing through the shadows as he moved cautiously. A faint sound stopped him in his tracks, a shuffle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. His heart quickened as he turned toward the source. The sound seemed to come from deeper within the wing, near the old mechanical room. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm but not unkind. Silence. Dr. Hartman hesitated. He wasn't sure what he expected, a stray animal, perhaps, or nothing at all. Yet something about the sound felt deliberate, as though someone was trying to stay hidden. He continued forward, his steps slow and deliberate. The flashlight revealed long-forgotten equipment covered in dust, its once gleaming surfaces now dull and lifeless. The air was thick with a musty smell of decay and neglect. As he approached the mechanical room, he noticed something unusual, a faint trail of small footprints in the dust. They were too small to belong to an adult. His chest tightened as he crouched down to examine them more closely. "They're fresh," he thought. His pulse quickened. The footprints led to a cluster of old furniture and boxes. Dr. Hartman could feel his heartbeat in his ears as he carefully moved closer, his flashlight casting long shadows. Behind a stack of boxes, he caught a glimpse of movement, a small figure crouched in the corner. "Hey," he said softly, lowering his voice to avoid startling whoever, or whatever, was there. "I'm not here to hurt you." The figure didn't respond. Dr. Hartman set his flashlight on the floor, angling it upward to create a softer light. He crouched, trying to appear less threatening. Slowly, the figure became clearer in the dim glow. A young boy, no older than 10, his dark skin smudged with dust. His clothes were worn and slightly oversized, as though they had been scavenged from donation bins. The boy's eyes, wide with fear, darted toward the flashlight, then back to Dr. Hartman. His small hands clutched something tightly to his chest, a tattered photograph. "What's your name?" Dr. Hartman asked, keeping his voice gentle. The boy didn't answer. He simply pressed himself further into the corner, his body language screaming mistrust. "It's okay." Dr. Hartman tried again. "You don't have to be afraid. My name's Elias. I'm a doctor here." For a moment, the boy remained silent, his small chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. Then, as if deciding that running wasn't an option, he whispered hoarsely, "Caleb." The name hung in the air between them, a fragile thread of connection. Dr. Hartman smiled faintly, though his heart ached at the sight of the boy's fear. "Caleb," he repeated, That's a strong name. The boy didn't respond, but his grip on the photograph tightened. Dr. Hartman gestured toward it carefully. Is that someone you know? Caleb glanced at the photograph, his expression softening slightly. My mom, he whispered, so quietly that Dr. Hartman had to lean closer to hear. Your mom? Dr. Hartman asked gently. Is she here with you? The question seemed to hit a nerve. Caleb's eyes welled up with tears, and he shook his head, his lips pressing together tightly, as though refusing to let more words escape. Dr. Hartman felt a lump in his throat. The boy's pain was palpable, a raw wound barely hidden beneath his guarded exterior. He wanted to ask more, but knew he needed to tread carefully. Okay, Dr. Hartman said softly. You don't have to tell me everything right now, but you shouldn't be here alone. It's not safe. Caleb's eyes narrowed, a flicker of defiance breaking through his fear. I'm not leaving, he said firmly. She told me to wait. She? Dr. Hartman echoed, his brow furrowing. Caleb nodded but didn't elaborate. His small frame seemed to shrink further into the corner, his body curling protectively around the photograph. Dr. Hartman sighed, his mind racing. Protocol dictated that he should contact hospital security or child services immediately. But looking at Caleb, this scared, determined child, he couldn't bring himself to act so quickly. Whatever had brought him here, it was clear that the boy had been through something unimaginable. All right, he said finally, rising slowly to his feet. I won't make you leave tonight, but I'll come back tomorrow. Will that be okay? Caleb didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. Dr. Hartman took it as a small victory. Before leaving, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a granola bar. He set it gently on the floor near Caleb, careful not to intrude on his space. Just in case you're hungry, he said with a faint smile. As he walked back through the darkened corridors, his flashlight illuminating the path ahead, Dr. Hartman couldn't shake the image of Caleb's frightened eyes. Questions swirled in his mind. Who was this boy? Why was he here? And most importantly, what had happened to him? That night, as he sat in his small apartment, Dr. Hartman found himself unable to sleep. He pulled out his laptop and began searching missing persons databases, hoping to find some clue about Caleb. But as the hours passed and the search yielded nothing, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. This was just the beginning. Shadows of the past. The early morning light filtered through the blinds of Dr. Hartman's modest apartment as he rubbed his temples, trying to stave off the exhaustion from a sleepless night. His search for answers about Caleb had been fruitless. No missing child reports matched his description. No clues emerged to explain how a boy so young had ended up living alone in the hospital's condemned wing. Elias stared at his coffee cup, the dark liquid now cold and uninviting. His thoughts were a whirlwind of questions, each more unsettling than the last. Who is he waiting for? And why here, of all places? Despite his grogginess, Elias knew one thing for certain. He had to go back. Caleb's situation demanded more than a cursory glance and bureaucratic intervention. The boy needed help, immediate, personal, and patient. The drive back to St. Martha's was uneventful, the city still waking up as commuters filled the streets. The hospital loomed ahead, a stark and imposing structure that had long been a beacon of hope and healing. Elias parked his car in the farthest corner of the lot, away from the prying eyes of security or colleagues who might question his intentions. Inside, the familiar hum of hospital life greeted him as nurses and doctors rushed about their duties. Elias made his way to the cafeteria, where he gathered a small assortment of supplies, a sandwich, juice, some fruit, and a couple of granola bars. Then, stopping by the nurse's station, he grabbed a clean blanket from the supply closet, stuffing it into a nondescript duffel bag. He was careful to appear casual, knowing that any suspicion could complicate his plans. The abandoned wing of the hospital was as silent as ever, the air still carrying that peculiar mix of decay and antiseptic. Elias retraced his steps from the previous night, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The faint scuffle of his shoes echoed eerily, reminding him just how isolated this section of the building was. When he reached Caleb's makeshift hideout, he was relieved to find the boy still there. Caleb sat cross-legged on his blanket, the photograph clutched tightly in his hands. He glanced up as Elias approached, his eyes wary but less fearful than the night before. "Morning, Caleb," Elias greeted, his voice warm and calm. He crouched down to Caleb's level, setting the duffel bag on the floor between them. "I brought you some breakfast." Caleb didn't respond, but his eyes flickered toward the bag, betraying a flicker of curiosity. Elias took this as a small win and began unpacking the food, laying it out on the floor as though setting up a picnic. "You don't have to eat now," Elias said gently, "but it's here if you want it." Caleb hesitated, then reached out cautiously for the juice box. His small fingers worked to poke the straw through the foil seal, and Elias noticed how thin and delicate his hands looked. The boy drank quickly, as though he hadn't had anything to drink in a while. Elias watched him silently, giving him space. Once Caleb seemed a little more at ease, he decided to ask a question that had been weighing on his mind. "Caleb," he began, choosing his words carefully, "you said last night that you're waiting for someone. Is it your mom?" Caleb froze, his eyes darting back to the photograph in his hands. For a long moment he said nothing, his small body rigid with tension. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "She told me to wait here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said she'd come back." Elias's heart ached at the quiet desperation in those words. He leaned forward slightly, his expression soft. "When did she tell you that?" Caleb's brow furrowed as he tried to remember. "A long time ago," he said finally. "I don't know how many days. But I have to wait. She said it's important." Elias nodded, though the boy's answer only deepened his concerns. It was clear that Caleb's mother had left him here with some kind of promise. But where was she now? Why hadn't she returned? The hospital's abandoned wing was no place for a child, no matter how resourceful he might be. "Can you tell me about her?" Elias asked gently, gesturing toward the photograph. "What's her name?" Caleb hesitated, clutching the photo closer as though afraid it might be taken from him. After a moment, he whispered, "Her name is Maria." Elias smiled softly. "That's a beautiful name. She must love you very much." The boy's eyes filled with tears, and he looked away quickly, his shoulders trembling. "She does," he said, his voice breaking. "She promised she'd come back. She has to." Elias's chest tightened. He wanted to reassure Caleb, to promise him that everything would be okay. But the truth was, he didn't have enough information to make such a promise. All he could do was offer his presence, his patience, and his determination to uncover the truth. As Caleb ate a small portion of the food Elias had brought, the doctor took the opportunity to observe the boy's makeshift home more closely. The space was surprisingly organized, with canned food neatly stacked and a few small belongings arranged with care. A flashlight lay beside the blanket, its batteries clearly well used, and a stack of books, mostly old paperbacks, rested against the wall. Elias picked up one of the books, a dog-eared copy of The Little Prince. He glanced at Caleb, who watched him cautiously but didn't object. "You like to read?" Elias asked, holding up the book. Caleb nodded slightly. "My mom used to read to me," he said. "She left these for me before she left." Elias flipped through the pages, noticing small doodles in the margins. They were childlike but thoughtful, little stars, flowers, and hearts. It was clear that the books held deep sentimental value for Caleb, a connection to the mother he missed so desperately. "She must have been a wonderful mom," Elias said softly, setting the book back down. He could see that Caleb's love for her was as strong as his fear of losing her. The day wore on as Elias stayed with Caleb, learning what little the boy was willing to share. Caleb spoke haltingly about his life before coming to the hospital, vague memories of a small apartment, a kind woman with a warm smile, and days filled with laughter. But when asked about why his mother had left him here, Caleb grew quiet, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't want to talk about it," he muttered. Elias didn't press. He knew that trust took time, and Caleb had already shared more than he'd expected. Instead, he shifted the conversation to lighter topics, asking about Caleb's favorite books, his favorite foods, and what he liked to do for fun. Slowly, the boy began to open up, his guarded demeanor softening just a little. As the afternoon turned to evening, Elias knew he couldn't stay much longer. He stood, brushing the dust from his knees, and looked down at Caleb. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said, just as he had the night before. "And I'll bring more food. Is there anything else you need?" Caleb hesitated, then glanced at the duffel bag Elias had brought. "Can you bring a notebook?" he asked shyly. "I like to draw." Elias smiled warmly. "Of course, I'll bring a notebook and some pencils." Caleb's expression softened, and for the first time, Elias thought he saw the hint of a smile. It was faint and fleeting, but it was there, a small crack in the armor the boy had built around himself. As Elias walked back through the abandoned corridors, his mind raced with possibilities. Caleb's story was far from complete, and Elias was determined to uncover the truth. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but the look in the boy's eyes, equal parts hope and heartbreak, gave him all the motivation he needed. That night, as Elias sat at his kitchen table, he pulled out a notepad and began jotting down everything he had learned. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let Caleb face it alone. The hidden truth. Dr. Elias Hartman woke early the next morning, the events of the past 2 days replaying in his mind. The image of Caleb, a boy too young to carry such burdens, haunted him. As he sipped his coffee, he reviewed the notes he had jotted down the previous night. He felt the urgency of Caleb's situation pressing heavily on him. If his mother had left him there intentionally, there must have been a reason, and Elias was determined to find out what it was. At the hospital, Elias made his rounds quickly, finishing his duties in record time. As he passed through the corridors, his colleagues gave him curious looks. Dr. Hartman was known for his meticulous attention to detail, yet today he seemed distracted. He barely paused to exchange pleasantries, his focus solely on returning to the abandoned wing where Caleb waited. Before heading there, Elias stopped by the cafeteria to gather supplies. This time, he added a notebook and a small box of colored pencils to the bag. He hoped that giving Caleb an outlet for his creativity might encourage the boy to open up more. The abandoned wing was as silent and foreboding as ever. Elias found his way to Caleb's makeshift shelter with practiced ease, his flashlight guiding the way. As he approached, he noticed the faint sound of humming, a soft, melancholic tune that echoed through the empty corridors. He paused just outside the boy's hideout, listening. The melody was haunting yet beautiful, and Elias realized it must be a song Caleb's mother had sung to him. He waited until the humming stopped before stepping into the dimly lit space. "Good morning, Caleb," Elias greeted warmly, setting the bag down on the floor. Caleb looked up from his spot on the blanket, the photograph still clutched in his hand. He gave a small nod but said nothing, his gaze wary. "I brought something for you," Elias continued, pulling out the notebook and colored pencils. He held them out, careful not to approach too quickly. "I thought you might like to draw." Caleb's eyes lit up for the briefest moment, a spark of interest breaking through his guarded expression. He reached out hesitantly, taking the notebook and pencils from Elias's hands. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias smiled, relieved to see a flicker of trust forming. He sat down cross-legged on the floor, giving Caleb space as the boy flipped through the blank pages of the notebook. "Do you like to draw?" Elias asked casually, hoping to start a conversation. Caleb nodded, his small fingers tracing the edges of the notebook. "I used to draw with my mom," he said softly. "She said I was good at it." Elias leaned back against the wall, watching as Caleb began to sketch. The boy's movements were deliberate and precise, his focus intense. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence broken only by the faint scratch of pencil on paper. As Caleb drew, Elias decided to ask a few gentle questions. "Caleb," he began, "can you tell me more about your mom? What was she like?" The boy paused, his pencil hovering over the page. "She was kind," he said finally. "She always took care of me, even when things were hard." Elias nodded, encouraging him to continue. "What kind of things did you do together?" Caleb's lips curved into a faint smile. "We used to play games," he said. "She'd make up stories, and I'd draw the pictures for them. She said I had a big imagination." Elias couldn't help but smile at the thought. "It sounds like she loved you very much." "She did," Caleb said firmly. Then his expression darkened, and he looked down at the photograph. "She said she'd come back. She promised." Elias felt a pang of sorrow at the boy's words. He knew better than to make empty reassurances, so he chose his next words carefully. "I believe she wanted what was best for you," he said gently. "Sometimes adults have to make hard decisions to keep their kids safe." Caleb didn't respond, but Elias could see the conflict in his eyes. The boy wanted to believe his mother's promise, but the weight of her absence was clearly taking its toll. As the day wore on, Elias shifted the conversation to lighter topics, asking Caleb about his favorite things. The boy spoke hesitantly at first, but gradually he began to open up. He talked about his favorite books, the games he used to play with his mom, and even a stray cat he had once befriended near their old apartment. Elias listened attentively, storing away every detail. He could see that Caleb was an intelligent, resourceful child who had endured far more than any boy his age should have to. It was clear that he had been loved deeply by his mother, and her absence left a void that Caleb was struggling to fill. That evening, as Elias prepared to leave, Caleb handed him the notebook. "I made this for you," he said shyly. Elias opened the notebook to find a detailed drawing of a sunny park. In the center of the scene, a man and a boy sat on a bench, surrounded by trees and flowers. It was a surprisingly intricate piece for a child, filled with small details that spoke of Caleb's talent. "This is beautiful, Caleb," Elias said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Thank you for sharing this with me." Caleb shrugged, but a faint blush crept into his cheeks. "It's just a drawing," he muttered. "No," Elias said firmly. "It's more than that. It shows how much you care about the people around you." The boy didn't reply, but Elias could see that his words had made an impact. As Elias left the abandoned wing, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Caleb was no longer just a mystery to solve. He was a child in need of love and support. Elias knew that uncovering the truth about Caleb's mother was the key to helping him heal, but he also understood that trust was the foundation of their relationship. That night, Elias returned to his computer, determined to dig deeper into the hospital's records. He searched for any mention of Maria, combing through employee files, patient records, and old incident reports. Hours passed as he sifted through the digital archives, his eyes growing heavy with fatigue. Finally, he found something, a discharge summary for a patient named Maria Calloway. The file was incomplete, but it indicated that Maria had been treated at St. Martha's a year earlier. The details were vague, but the notes mentioned a young son and a complicated social situation. Elias's heart raced as he read the sparse details. This was the lead he had been searching for. If he could uncover more about Maria's time at the hospital, he might be able to piece together the puzzle of Caleb's story. But as he delved deeper into the records, he realized that the answers he sought wouldn't come easily. Many of the files were missing or redacted, and the few details he could find only raised more questions. Who had Maria been running from? And why had she chosen to leave Caleb in such a precarious situation? Elias knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but he was determined to see it through. Caleb deserved answers, and more importantly, he deserved a chance at a better future. For the first time in years, Elias felt a spark of hope. He wasn't just a doctor treating a patient. He was a man fighting for a child's life, and he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. The Forgotten Files. Dr. Elias Hartman returned to St. Martha's Memorial Hospital the following morning with a renewed sense of determination. The faint lead he had discovered about Maria Calloway weighed heavily on his mind. The incomplete file, vague as it was, hinted at a story of desperation, struggle, and heartbreak. Elias suspected there was more to Maria's disappearance than the system had documented, and if he was going to help Caleb, he needed to dig deeper. After his morning rounds, Elias slipped away to the hospital's administrative wing. This section of the hospital, much like the abandoned pediatric ward, was a labyrinth of neglected archives and outdated filing systems. Few employees ventured here, preferring the streamlined efficiency of digital records, but Elias knew that older cases often held clues that hadn't made their way into the new system. The air in the archive room was stale, heavy with the scent of aging paper and dust. Row upon row of filing cabinets stretched before him, their labels faded and peeling. Elias scanned the cabinets, his eyes searching for anything that might lead him to Maria Calloway. Finally, he found a section labeled Discharged Patients, 2010 to 2020. He pulled open a drawer and began rifling through the files, his fingers brushing against brittle pages. Hours passed as he sifted through stacks of medical records, incident reports, and social work referrals. His patience was rewarded when he stumbled upon a thin, worn folder labeled Maria Calloway. The file was sparse, but what it contained sent a chill through Elias's body. Maria had been admitted to the hospital over a year ago, suffering from a combination of malnutrition and severe stress. Her records indicated that she was a single mother, struggling to care for her son after fleeing an abusive relationship. The notes were brief but damning. History of domestic violence, no known family support, and declined social services intervention. Elias's heart ached as he read through the clinical language that failed to capture the depth of Maria's pain. The file included a single photograph of Maria and Caleb together, likely taken during a visit from a hospital social worker. In the picture, Maria's face was drawn and tired, but her eyes shone with fierce determination as she held her son close. Caleb, much younger in the photo, wore a small, shy smile, his tiny hands gripping his mother's arm. The final entry in the file was dated 8 months prior. It was a discharge summary, signed by a Dr. Neil Rowan. The summary stated that Maria had been medically stable at the time of her release, but was still in a precarious living situation. No follow-up had been documented, and the file ended abruptly. Elias sat back, the folder resting on his lap. The story the file told was incomplete, but it was enough to give him a clearer picture of what Maria had been facing. She had likely been trying to protect Caleb from the man she had fled, doing whatever it took to keep him safe. But why had she left him in the hospital's abandoned wing? And where was she now? Determined to find out more, Elias decided to track down Dr. Neil Rowan, the physician who had signed Maria's discharge summary. A quick search of the hospital's directory revealed that Rowan had retired 6 months earlier. However, Elias found a forwarding address for him in the staff records. Later that day, Elias made his way to the address listed for Dr. Rowan. It led him to a modest house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by overgrown shrubs and a faded picket fence. He knocked on the door, unsure of what kind of reception he would receive. An older man with silver hair and a weathered face answered. He eyed Elias with curiosity, then recognition. "Elias Hartman," Rowan said, his voice gruff but friendly. "I remember you from St. Martha's. You're the young doctor with the impeccable bedside manner." Elias smiled politely, though his mind was racing. "Dr. Rowan, I need your help with a patient you discharged last year, a woman named Maria Calloway." Rowan's expression darkened. He stepped aside, motioning for Elias to enter. The inside of the house was cozy but cluttered, with books and medical journals piled on every surface. Rowan gestured for Elias to sit, then poured 2 cups of coffee before taking a seat across from him. "I remember Maria," Rowan said after a long pause. "She was one of the toughest cases I dealt with. Smart, resilient, but utterly broken by what she'd been through. That woman loved her son more than anything, though. She'd have walked through fire for him. Elias nodded, leaning forward. Do you know what happened to her after she was discharged? Rowan shook his head, his expression troubled. I tried to follow up, but she fell off the radar. Social services couldn't locate her, and the phone number she gave us stopped working. I always feared the worst. Elias hesitated, then pulled out the photograph he had taken from the file. Her son, Caleb, is living in the hospital's abandoned wing. He told me she asked him to wait there for her. Do you have any idea why she would do that? Rowan's face fell, and he rubbed his temples. Damn it, he muttered. I don't know. Maybe she thought it was the safest place she could leave him, a place where no one would think to look. She must have been desperate. Rowan's words confirmed what Elias had suspected. Maria had likely left Caleb in the hospital to protect him, believing it was safer than the streets or a shelter where her abuser might find them. But the question of her whereabouts remained unanswered. Do you know if she mentioned anyone who might have been helping her? Elias asked. A friend, a relative, anyone. Rowan shook his head. She was completely isolated, but she did mention something about a plan, a way to make things right. She didn't go into detail, and I didn't press her. Now I wish I had. Elias's mind raced. Maria's plan could explain why she had left Caleb behind. Perhaps she had intended to return for him, but had been prevented by something or someone. That evening, Elias returned to the hospital with a heavy heart. He made his way to Caleb's hideout, where the boy was waiting with his usual guarded expression. Elias sat down beside him, setting the duffel bag on the floor. I found some things about your mom, Elias said gently. She's been through a lot, Caleb, but I think she was trying to protect you. Caleb's eyes filled with tears, and he clutched the photograph tightly. She promised she'd come back, he whispered. She wouldn't break her promise. Elias placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. We'll figure this out together, he said. I'm not giving up, and neither should you. For the first time, Caleb leaned into Elias's touch, his small frame trembling. Elias held him gently, vowing silently to uncover the truth and give Caleb the closure he so desperately needed. As the night wore on, Elias sat beside Caleb as the boy drifted into a restless sleep. The questions in his mind were louder than ever, but one thing was clear. Maria Calloway had sacrificed everything for her son. Now, it was up to Elias to ensure that sacrifice wasn't in vain. Pieces of the puzzle. Elias stayed beside Caleb until the boy's breathing evened out, his small body relaxing into a fitful sleep. The harsh fluorescent glow of his flashlight illuminated the dusty corners of the abandoned wing, casting long shadows on the walls. It was hard to reconcile the image of Caleb's fragile figure curled on a makeshift bed with the fierce determination Maria Calloway had shown in the records Elias had read. This child had been her entire world, and yet she had vanished without a trace. Elias gently stood, careful not to wake Caleb, and pulled out his phone. If Maria had left any clues behind, they might be buried deeper in the hospital's older archives. He made a mental note to search for anything unusual, a sudden termination, financial difficulties, or unexplained behavior around the time of her discharge. He'd need access to the off-site storage where physical records from decades past were kept, a daunting but necessary step. Before leaving, Elias placed a small lantern he had brought from home near Caleb's bed. Its soft, warm light would give the boy some comfort in the oppressive darkness of the abandoned wing. He left the boy a note as well, written in bold, clear letters. Caleb, I'll be back tomorrow. Don't worry. You're not alone. Dr. Elias. The archives. A forgotten lead. The next morning, Elias bypassed his usual routine and went straight to the hospital administration office. He had no intention of asking permission to access the off-site storage. That would raise too many questions. Instead, he found Grace, one of the older clerks who had worked at the hospital for over 3 decades. Dr. Hartman, Grace greeted, adjusting her glasses. "What brings you to this corner of the hospital?" Elias leaned against her desk, offering a friendly smile. "Grace, I need a favor. It's about some older patient files. Mid-2000s, specifically." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Those would be in the storage facility downtown. What are you looking for?" Elias hesitated, careful with his words. "I'm following up on a case, a patient named Maria Calloway. She was discharged about a year ago, but there's missing information in her file. I think the answer might be in the older archives." Grace pursed her lips, considering his request. "You're lucky I'm the one you asked," she said finally. "Most of the staff wouldn't bother with those dusty old boxes, but I'll warn you, it's a mess down there." Elias smiled gratefully. "I'll take whatever I can get." Within an hour, he was standing in the dimly lit basement of the off-site storage facility. Metal shelves stretched endlessly before him, each stacked with boxes labeled by year and department. Armed with a clipboard and a flashlight, Elias began his search, rifling through boxes of old records, incident reports, and employee logs. Hours passed, and just as Elias began to lose hope, he stumbled upon a box labeled Pediatrics, 2019 to 2021. Inside, he found what appeared to be a collection of incident reports from the pediatric ward. One particular file caught his attention. Unauthorized presence in pediatric wing. Maria Calloway. The report detailed an incident where Maria, after her official discharge, had been found wandering the pediatric ward late at night. A nurse had discovered her sitting by one of the cribs, cradling her son and singing softly to him. The report stated that Maria had been distraught and uncooperative when asked to leave and had claimed, "This is the only safe place for him." Elias's hands shook as he read the final note in the report, referred to hospital security for further action. No additional follow-up documented. What had driven Maria to return to the hospital after her discharge? And why had no one followed up on her obvious distress? A whisper of danger. Back at his apartment that evening, Elias spread the documents across his dining table, organizing them chronologically. The picture they painted was troubling. Maria had been a woman on the run, terrified for her son's safety. Her visits to the hospital after her discharge suggested that she had seen it as a sanctuary, a place where Caleb could be protected. But from what or whom? Elias's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at his door. He opened it to find Detective Olivia Rains, an acquaintance who occasionally consulted with the hospital on legal matters. "Olivia," Elias said, surprised. "What brings you here?" She held up a manila folder. "You've been digging into a case, haven't you? Maria Calloway." Elias stepped aside to let her in, his curiosity piqued. "How do you know about that?" Olivia set the folder on the table and sighed. Because her case wasn't just a medical issue. It was a police matter too. Maria filed multiple reports against her ex-partner, a man named Victor Reardon. "He's dangerous, Elias. Abusive, manipulative, and well-connected." She disappeared shortly after a restraining order was issued against him. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you think he found her?" Olivia hesitated, then nodded grimly. "It's possible. Reardon has a history of stalking and violence. Maria might have gone into hiding to protect Caleb." Elias sank into a chair, his mind racing. That explains why she left him at the hospital. She must have thought it was the only place he'd be safe. Olivia tapped the folder. "There's more. Reardon's been under investigation for illegal activities, human trafficking, drug running, you name it. If Maria had information about his operations, she could have been a target." Elias's stomach turned. He looked at Olivia, determination hardening in his gaze. "I need to find her, Olivia. Caleb's still waiting for her. He believes she's coming back." Olivia placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll do what I can to help. But you need to be careful, Elias. If Reardon is involved, you're dealing with a very dangerous man. The weight of responsibility." That night, Elias returned to Caleb's hideout, his heart heavy with the knowledge he had gained. The boy looked up as he entered, his eyes filled with cautious hope. "Did you find out anything about my mom?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling. Elias sat down beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I did," he said gently. "Your mom loves you very much, Caleb. She's been trying to protect you from someone who might hurt you." Caleb's eyes widened. "She's still alive, isn't she?" "She's coming back." Elias hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "I don't know for sure," he admitted, "but I promise you this. I'll do everything I can to find her. You're not alone in this." For the first time, Caleb leaned into Elias, his small body trembling with silent sobs. Elias held him tightly, vowing silently to keep the boy safe, no matter what it took. As Caleb drifted to sleep, Elias stared into the dim light of the lantern, his mind churning with plans. He knew he had to move quickly. If Victor Reardon was still a threat, then both Maria and Caleb's lives were in danger. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they revealed was far more sinister than Elias had anticipated. And now he was more determined than ever to ensure that Maria's sacrifices hadn't been in vain. The predator's shadow. The morning sun barely cut through the haze of Elias Hartman's restless night. Sleep had eluded him. The weight of Caleb's fragile hope and the looming specter of Victor Reardon occupied every corner of his mind. The thought of Maria Calloway, a mother desperate to protect her son, made Elias's resolve even stronger. He had to uncover the truth, not only for Caleb's sake, but to bring closure to a story riddled with pain and uncertainty. Elias reviewed the fragmented details Olivia had shared the previous night. Victor Reardon wasn't just a common thug. He was a man whose cruelty operated in the shadows of society. With powerful connections and a willingness to destroy anything in his path, he represented the kind of threat Maria had been running from. Elias knew he was now stepping into dangerous territory. The next clue. After finishing his rounds at the hospital, Elias called Olivia. Her investigation into Reardon might provide answers that medical files could not. When she picked up, her voice was curt but steady. "I've been looking into Reardon's activities," Olivia said. "There's a disturbing pattern here. Every woman who's filed a restraining order against him disappears within 6 months. Most are never found." Elias gripped his phone tightly, the grim reality of Maria's situation sinking in. "What about Maria?" he asked. "Could she still be alive?" "It's possible," Olivia replied. "But if she's alive, she's in hiding. There's no record of her since she left the hospital. No bank activity, no utility bills, nothing. It's like she vanished into thin air." Elias's stomach churned. Maria's meticulous disappearance was both a testament to her resourcefulness and a glaring sign of the danger she faced. He realized he needed more than Olivia's help. He needed someone who could navigate the underworld Reardon operated in. A dangerous ally. Elias made a call he never thought he'd make. An old patient of his, Marcus Shade Carter, owed him a favor. Shade had been a fixer of sorts, a man who operated on the fringes of legality, often cleaning up messes others didn't want to acknowledge. Elias had saved his life after a near-fatal accident years ago, and though they hadn't kept in touch, Shade's gratitude had been unwavering. "Dr. Hartman," Shade's deep, gravelly voice greeted him when he picked up. "Never thought I'd hear from you again. What's the matter? Got a problem that needs solving?" Elias hesitated, knowing full well what he was stepping into. "I need information on a man named Victor Reardon. I think he's connected to a woman's disappearance, and her son's life might depend on what I find." Shade let out a low whistle. "Reardon's bad news, Doc. Real bad. You sure you want to get involved?" "I don't have a choice," Elias said firmly. "There's a child involved. He's depending on me." Shade was silent for a moment before replying. "All right. I'll dig around, see what I can find. But be careful. Reardon's the kind of guy who doesn't leave loose ends." Back at the hideout. That evening, Elias returned to Caleb's hideout, carrying more supplies and a quiet determination. The boy was sitting cross-legged on his blanket, sketching in the notebook Elias had given him. The drawing was of a house surrounded by trees, with two figures standing in the yard, a woman with long hair and a small boy holding her hand. Elias crouched down beside Caleb. "That's beautiful," he said, pointing to the drawing. "Is that you and your mom?" Caleb nodded, his eyes focused on the page. "I drawed it so I don't forget what she looks like," he said quietly. Elias's chest tightened. "You won't forget her," he said gently. "She's with you in everything you do." Caleb looked up at him, his eyes wide and searching. "Do you think she's okay? Do you think she's coming back?" Elias hesitated, torn between the desire to reassure Caleb and the harsh reality of what he knew. "I think your mom loves you more than anything," he said carefully. "And I think she'd do whatever it takes to keep you safe." The boy nodded, seeming to draw some comfort from Elias's words. For a moment, they sat in silence, the dim glow of the lantern casting soft shadows on the walls. Shade's call. Later that night, Elias's phone buzzed with a message from Shade. "Meet me at the docks. Midnight. Got something you'll want to hear." Elias's heart raced as he read the message. He knew the docks were a hub for illicit activity, and the prospect of venturing into Reardon's territory filled him with unease. But if Shade had found a lead, it was worth the risk. At midnight, Elias arrived at the docks, the air thick with the scent of salt and diesel fuel. Shade was waiting near a rusted shipping container, his broad frame silhouetted against the faint glow of a street lamp. "I got some bad news," Shade said as Elias approached. "Reardon's been asking around about a kid, a boy about Caleb's age." Elias's blood ran cold. "You mean he knows Caleb's still here?" Shade nodded grimly. "Not for sure, but he's looking. Word is, he thinks the kid might have something, or know something, that could incriminate him. That's why Maria went off the grid. She probably knew too much." Elias felt a surge of urgency. "Is there any chance Maria's alive?" Shade shrugged. "If she is, she's not anywhere Reardon can find her. But if he gets wind that the boy's at the hospital, it won't end well." The plan. Elias returned to the hospital, his mind racing. He knew Caleb couldn't stay in the abandoned wing any longer. It was only a matter of time before someone, Reardon or hospital staff, discovered him. Elias needed to act fast, but moving Caleb without alerting anyone would be a challenge. The next morning, Elias called Olivia again. "I need your help," he said. "I have to get Caleb out of the hospital, somewhere safe. Do you know of any places he could stay?" Olivia sighed. "There's a shelter run by a former police officer. It's off the grid, and they specialize in protecting domestic violence survivors. I can make the arrangements, but it'll take a day or two." Elias glanced at the clock. "We might not have that long. Reardon's people are already asking questions." A close call. That evening, as Elias made his way to Caleb's hideout, he noticed something that made his heart drop. The faint sound of voices in the distance. He froze, listening intently. The voices were low, gruff, and unfamiliar. Two men, their tone casual but with an edge of menace. Elias ducked into a shadowy alcove, his mind racing. Reardon's men, he realized. They're looking for Caleb. He waited until the voices faded, then sprinted to Caleb's hideout. The boy was sitting on his blanket, oblivious to the danger. "Caleb," Elias said urgently, crouching down in front of him. "We need to go. Now." Caleb's eyes widened. "Why? What's wrong?" "I'll explain later," Elias said, grabbing the boy's few belongings and stuffing them into his bag. "But we can't stay here. It's not safe." Caleb hesitated, his small frame trembling. "Are they coming for me?" he whispered. Elias placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I won't let anyone hurt you," he said firmly. "But we have to move fast." As Elias led Caleb through the dark corridors, his mind raced with contingency plans. He couldn't wait for Olivia's shelter arrangements. He needed to find a temporary safe house immediately. His thoughts turned to Shade. The fixer had a network of contacts and hideouts, and Elias hoped he'd be willing to extend that protection to Caleb. They slipped out of the hospital undetected, Elias's heart pounding with every step. He glanced down at Caleb, who clung to his hand, his eyes wide with fear. "We're going to be okay," Elias said, more for Caleb's benefit than his own. "I promise." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was just beginning. A mother's sacrifice. The night air was cold and sharp as Elias led Caleb through the shadowed streets, the boy's small hand clutching his tightly. Every sound, a passing car, the rustle of leaves, felt magnified, each one a potential threat. Elias kept his pace steady, his mind racing with questions. Where could he take Caleb? Who could he trust? He knew one thing for certain. They couldn't return to the hospital. Elias pulled out his phone and called Shade. The fixer answered after the first ring. "Doc," Shade said, his tone urgent. "You're out in the open, aren't you?" "Yes," Elias admitted. "We need somewhere safe, immediately." Shade didn't hesitate. "Head to the warehouse on 5th and Maple. I'll meet you there. Don't let anyone follow you." Elias ended the call and looked down at Caleb. The boy's face was pale, his wide eyes reflecting both fear and trust. "We're almost there," Elias said gently. "Just a little further." The warehouse. The warehouse was an imposing structure, its faded exterior giving no indication of the security measures within. Shade met them at the back entrance, his large frame casting a protective shadow over the pair. "This way," Shade said, leading them inside. The space was surprisingly well equipped, with a makeshift living area tucked into one corner and a monitoring station with multiple screens displaying live feeds from hidden cameras. "It's not much," Shade said, gesturing toward the couch and blankets. "But it's safe. No one will find you here." Elias nodded gratefully. "Thank you." Shade crouched in front of Caleb, his gruff exterior softening slightly. "Hey, kid," he said. "You're a brave one, aren't you?" Caleb didn't respond, but he clung to Elias's side, his small frame trembling. Shade straightened and turned to Elias. "Reardon's people are sniffing around. They've been asking questions about you too." Elias's stomach sank. "About me?" Shade nodded. "You've made yourself a problem for him. That makes you a target." Maria's message. As the hours dragged on, Elias sat beside Caleb, who had fallen into a restless sleep. Shade had left to gather more intel, leaving Elias alone with his thoughts. He couldn't stop thinking about Maria, her courage, her determination to protect Caleb, and the sacrifices she had made. He wondered if she was still alive, still fighting to keep her son safe. Just as Elias began to drift into an uneasy sleep, his phone buzzed. It was Olivia. "I found something," she said, her voice tense. "There's a storage unit registered under Maria's name on the outskirts of town. It's been paid for in cash for the past year." Elias's heart leaped. Could she be using it as a safe house? "I don't know," Olivia had admitted, "but it's worth checking out. I'm sending you the address." Elias glanced at Caleb, who was still sleeping. He knew the boy couldn't be left alone, but he also couldn't ignore this lead. When Shade returned, Elias explained the situation. The fixer listened silently, then nodded. "Go," Shade said. "I'll watch the kid. You have my word. No one will touch him." Elias hesitated, but Shade's steady gaze reassured him. "Thank you," he said. The storage unit. The storage facility was located in a remote industrial area, its rows of units illuminated by flickering streetlights. Elias parked his car outside and made his way to unit number 48, his pulse quickening with each step. The air was thick with anticipation as he inserted the key Olivia had obtained from the facility's manager. The door creaked open, revealing a meticulously organized space, a small cot, a portable stove, and shelves lined with canned food suggested someone had been living there. Elias's eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of Maria. On the far wall, a corkboard caught his attention. It was covered with photographs, maps, and handwritten notes. Many of the photos were of Caleb, taken during happier times. There was also a single photograph of a man Elias recognized from Shade's description, Victor Reardon. Pinned beneath Reardon's photo was a handwritten note. The truth will protect him. Elias's gaze moved to a file folder resting on the desk. Inside, he found copies of legal documents, financial records, and what appeared to be a detailed log of Reardon's criminal activities. Maria had been gathering evidence that could bring Reardon down. A mother's final stand. As Elias flipped through the documents, he noticed one entry in Maria's handwriting. "If something happens to me, take this to Detective Olivia Raines." Elias's chest tightened. Maria had prepared for the worst, knowing the risks she was taking. She had trusted that someone, anyone, would find this evidence and use it to protect her son. Suddenly, Elias's phone buzzed. It was Shade. "Doc, you need to get back here. Now." "What's wrong?" Elias asked, his voice tense. "They found us," Shade said. "I've got the kid, but Reardon's men are closing in. I can't hold them off for long." Elias's blood ran cold. "I'm on my way." The escape. Elias drove like a man possessed, the storage unit's contents sitting on the passenger seat. He knew the evidence was critical, but Caleb's safety was his top priority. When he arrived at the warehouse, he found Shade standing guard at the entrance, his imposing frame blocking the doorway. "They're circling like vultures," Shade said grimly. "We need to move. Now." Inside, Caleb was huddled on the couch, his eyes wide with fear. Elias crouched beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's going to be okay," he said firmly. "We're getting out of here." Shade had already prepared an escape plan. "I've got a car out back," he said. "It's untraceable. You take the kid and head to the shelter Olivia mentioned. I'll stay here and deal with Reardon's goons." Elias hesitated. "Shade, you don't have to." Shade cut him off with a grim smile. "You saved my life once, Doc. Let me return the favor. A new beginning." With Shade's help, Elias and Caleb slipped out the back of the warehouse and into the waiting car. As they drove through the darkened streets, Elias couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every passing car, every shadow seemed like a potential threat. But eventually, they'd reached the shelter, a small, nondescript building surrounded by high fences. Olivia was waiting for them at the entrance. "You made it," she said, relief evident in her voice. She ushered them inside, where Caleb was greeted by a kind woman who introduced herself as the shelter's director. Elias knelt beside Caleb. "You're safe now," he said. "These people will take care of you." Caleb looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears. "What about you?" he asked. Elias smiled softly. "I'll be back to visit, but right now, I have to finish what your mom started. The final steps." With Caleb safe, Elias turned his attention to delivering the evidence to Olivia. The files Maria had compiled were damning, detailing Reardon's network and linking him to multiple crimes. Olivia wasted no time, calling in reinforcements and launching a coordinated effort to take Reardon down. Days later, Elias stood outside the shelter, watching as Caleb played with a group of other children. The boys' laughter was a sound Elias hadn't heard in weeks, and it filled him with a quiet sense of hope. Maria's fate remained uncertain, but her love for her son had been undeniable. She had sacrificed everything to protect Caleb. And now, with Reardon's empire crumbling, Elias felt that her mission had been fulfilled. As Caleb ran toward him, smiling brightly, Elias knelt down and opened his arms. The boy hugged him tightly, his small voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you." Elias held him close, his heart full. "You're welcome," he said. "You're going to be okay, Caleb. I promise." And for the first time, Elias truly believed it. Justice and closure. The shelter's warmth offered a stark contrast to the chill Elias had carried with him since the moment he found Caleb in the abandoned wing of the hospital. Caleb was safe for now, but the fight wasn't over. Victor Reardon was still out there, and Maria's fate hung in the balance. Elias spent the next few days working tirelessly alongside Detective Olivia Raines to piece together the evidence Maria had left behind. The documents from the storage unit were damning. They detailed money laundering, human trafficking operations, and the names of several powerful individuals complicit in Reardon's schemes. Maria's handwritten notes highlighted connections that even Olivia found shocking. "This is enough to launch a full-scale operation," Olivia said as she sifted through the evidence. "With this, we can put Reardon and his entire network away for good." But Elias wasn't satisfied. "What about Maria?" he asked. "She's the reason we have this evidence in the first place. If she's still alive, we owe it to her to bring her back." Olivia hesitated. "Elias, I want to believe she's alive too. But Reardon doesn't leave loose ends. If she's still out there, it's a miracle." Elias clenched his fists, refusing to accept defeat. "Then let's make sure that miracle happens. Reardon's empire crumbles." 2 days later, Elias sat in Olivia's office as she coordinated a multi-agency raid on several locations tied to Reardon's operations. Armed with Maria's evidence, law enforcement moved swiftly, seizing assets, arresting key figures, and dismantling the infrastructure of Reardon's criminal empire. The raids were a success. Dozens of arrests were made, and warehouses filled with illegal goods were uncovered. Reardon, however, remained elusive. "He's running," Olivia said, her frustration evident. "We've cut off his resources, but he's still out there." Elias couldn't shake the feeling that Maria's disappearance and Reardon's escape were connected. He pressed Olivia for more resources to locate Maria, convinced that finding her was the key to cornering Reardon. A shocking discovery. Late one evening, as Elias prepared to leave the shelter after visiting Caleb, Olivia called him. Her tone was urgent. "We found something," she said. "A cabin in the woods, about 50 miles outside the city. It's tied to one of Reardon's shell companies. There's a chance Maria was taken there." Elias's heart raced. "I'm going with you." "No," Olivia said firmly. "It's too dangerous. Let the team handle it." But Elias refused to stay behind. "This isn't just a case for me, Olivia. I need to be there." Reluctantly, she agreed, and the two of them joined a team of officers on the mission. The drive to the cabin was tense, the road winding through dense woods that seemed to close in around them. When they arrived, the cabin appeared deserted, its windows dark, and its exterior weathered. The team moved in cautiously, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and neglect. The officers swept through the rooms, finding signs that someone had been living there: discarded clothing, empty food cans, and a makeshift bed in the corner. But the cabin was empty. Then, in the basement, they found something that stopped Elias in his tracks: a small notebook with Maria's handwriting. The pages were filled with hastily scrawled notes, including one that read, "He'll come for Caleb. Protect him at all costs." "She was here," Elias said, his voice trembling. "She's alive." The final confrontation. The discovery of the notebook reignited the search for Maria. Over the next 24 hours, Olivia's team traced Reardon's movements using information from the cabin. They tracked him to an abandoned industrial site on the outskirts of the city. This time, Elias didn't ask for permission to join the raid. He arrived with Olivia, his resolve unshakable. If Maria was there, he needed to see her, to tell her that Caleb was safe. The raid began under the cover of darkness. Officers moved in swiftly, securing the perimeter while others breached the main building. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing through the night. Elias stayed close to Olivia, his heart pounding as they navigated the chaos. In a back room, they found Maria. She was alive, though barely. Her wrists were bound, her face bruised, and her body weakened from weeks of captivity. When she saw Elias, her eyes filled with tears. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Is he?" "He's safe," Elias said, rushing to her side. "He's at a shelter, waiting for you." Maria broke down, her sobs a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Olivia called for medics as Elias untied Maria and held her trembling body. "You did it," Elias said softly. "You kept him safe. It's over now." Reunion and healing. 2 days later, Maria and Caleb were reunited at the shelter. The boy ran into his mother's arms, clinging to her as though he would never let go. Elias stood back, watching the emotional reunion with tears in his eyes. Maria looked up at him, her gratitude evident. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved my son." Elias shook his head. "You saved him, Maria. I just helped him hold on until you could come back." The shelter provided Maria and Caleb with a safe place to rebuild their lives, while Olivia and her team ensured that Reardon's remaining associates were brought to justice. For Elias, the experience changed him profoundly. He returned to his work at the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that he had made a difference. Epilogue. Months later, Elias visited the shelter, bringing a new notebook and pencils for Caleb. The boy had blossomed in the care of his mother and the shelter staff, his laughter filling the once quiet halls. As Elias prepared to leave, Maria stopped him. "You didn't just save Caleb," she said. "You saved me too. I didn't think there were people like you left in the world." Elias smiled, his heart full. "You reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place." As he drove away, Elias felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The scars of his own past hadn't disappeared, but helping Maria and Caleb had given his life new meaning. The darkness of the abandoned wing was far behind him now, replaced by the light of hope and resilience. And for the first time in a long time, Elias knew he wasn't alone in the fight for a better world.